My name's Professor Martin Hook. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture and Urban Design at RMIT, and I'm also a member of the executive of the Urban Futures Enabling Capability Platform, which, for those of you who don't know about our ECPs, is an elaborate way of describing how researchers across RMIT work together around ideas of urban futures. And also, similarly, we have a series of other ECPs in other areas. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and the Bunurong language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands the university does its business. RMIT University respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders past and present, and RMIT also acknowledges the traditional custodians of their ancestors and the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. Thank you all for coming along today. I hope that many of you have been enjoying the delights of Melbourne Design Week, which has been massive this year. RMIT's been involved with 53 different events, and this one is almost the last one that I have to go to, at least. There's a few more coming up. One of the things that we wanted to do, we've been in discussion with the NGV around some of our research and how that might relate to things that the NGV is interested in terms of developing its program in a regional context. And through conversations with the Senior Curator of Architecture and Design, Ewan McEwen, we discussed the idea of having a symposium of some form that would begin to look at high-speed rail to the regions and to really draw on our research that we're doing at the moment through the Centre for Urban Research in particular, but also throughout the Urban Futures ECP, just in terms of looking at what the consequences of high-speed rail might be. To shift away from the train itself and actually start to look at what might the train facilitate. In that context, we thought it would be useful today to maybe discuss with a bias towards the idea of housing and land settlement, but also really to look at the ways in which, through our collaboration with New Haven and our platform that we share with them, Balance Victoria, to look at the ways in which we can understand what a shift in the population to regional Australia might do and how we might look at working with regional communities to prepare them for the consequences of what this shift in population might mean. Obviously, I had nothing to do with the announcement that the Prime Minister made that's on the front page of the Herald Sun today, but it certainly draws attention to the idea that a faster rail, not quite high speed, I'm sorry, but a faster rail network in Victoria can begin to open up some real opportunities. And through our collaboration with Balance Victoria, we're looking at what they might be and presenting a series of papers through our website, actually beginning to interrogate perhaps some of the numbers around this, but also for us to look at what that might look like, where these opportunities might be cited. From our perspective, we think that there is an opportunity to recalibrate our regional centres and to perhaps shift them into forming new types of urbanism. Transport-orientated urbanism that privileges the pedestrian, that are walkable, bikeable, that develop communities that actually generate their own power, deal with their own waste, collect their own water, and really start to talk very differently about perhaps some of the consequences that the high-speed rail might bring. From our point of view, Geelong opens a really clear opportunity. If we start to look at the areas of North Geelong through to Coria, we see the opportunities there of a post-industrial landscape where we might actually start to understand what these new forms of community might be. And in today's discussion, we have several guest speakers who will be talking about housing provision through the Nightingale housing model, but also looking at ways in which this is currently happening in Europe and the US, and beginning to look at how we might start to rethink perhaps a third way of occupying our land, and really be looking at ways in which living might become far more sustainable, and our focus around the generating of communities that perhaps are far more meaningful to a 21st century existence rather than being driven by models that are formed in the 18th century. So today we'll also have a conversation at the end we have some people in from ACOM and really beginning to look at perhaps an overarching strategy, but really beginning to unpack some of the economics that might be behind these agendas. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Patrick McNamara, former Deputy Premier of Victoria, who is a key member of our board at Balance Victoria and has really been involved with us around the high-speed rail conversations for quite some time, almost 3 years. So I'll invite Patrick to the stage to share some of his thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Martin, and it's been, I think, really valuable for us to have you as the Dean of the School of Architecture here at the RMIT working with us in the Balance Victoria program. This was a document that Steve Braxton and I launched here back in August, I think, and it's up on our website, so if anyone wants to tap into that. There's a lot of really interesting data in that, and it really sets the scene as to why we need to do something. There's a lot of people who have said that livability, which Melbourne has, if not been top of the world in, it's been second or third, always well placed. That livability is one thing that we really pride ourselves in Melbourne about. But all the stats, when you look worldwide, shows that cities, once they reach 5 million, livability starts to sink like a stone. And I think we're seeing a lot of those pressures that are happening in Melbourne now. We're going through a really interesting period in Melbourne particularly, but I suppose in the rest of the country and also in places like Sydney, where we're seeing the largest growth in population since the gold rush of the 1850s and 60s. I think last year we had a growth in Melbourne of around 120,000 people. Now that's bigger than Ballarat or Bendigo. Significant growth. What we're seeing though is that it's very centralised and it continues to spill out towards the fringes. So the Point Cooks and the Craigieburns and areas out to the west continue to grow, almost disorganised. And I think what high-speed rail offers is it offers connectivity. It enables us to tap into areas perhaps 100 kilometres out and have access with high-speed rail, genuine high-speed rail of over 300 kilometres an hour, back into the centre of the city within 20 to 30 minutes. And that's a game changer. I think what it then does put in those regions an opportunity for people to live in those regions and perhaps commute back to Melbourne. Eventually, as more jobs are created in the regions, I think you'll see that even lessen off. But if people wanted to come into last night's football match at the MCG or come to a show in the city at one of the theatres on a Friday or Saturday night, all those things are quite achievable for people right within that arc. So I think we saw when we created, I suppose, connectivity when we put in CityLink back in the 1990s, a lot of that arc where the CityLink freeway ran through was just bare paddocks. And I remember driving around it and there was bugger all traffic on the freeway. And as I said, green grass for a fair portion of it. It was so quickly filled in by industry with factories when they realised that they had that accessibility, linking the ports to those areas that before were probably beyond their reach. Melbourne has always had that, as most Australian cities, the quarter-acre block mentality. We've seen obviously some bigger growth in the inner Melbourne area, but we've seen very little growth in large population numbers within those inner suburbs, and then the rest spills out to the outer fringes, like the Point Cooks and the Craigieburns. And there's been that pushback from the Save Our Suburbs group who've said, well, do it somewhere else, but not in our area. So the rail, I think, offers an opportunity for us to really focus on if we can develop expansion to areas like Geelong and create new urban developments in those areas. And Golden Plains, I think, is another area that we could actually see some development in. We actually start to really rethink about how we actually build these cities and do them at not just better than what we have done, but really set a scene for doing the world's best. And as Martin said, there are so many opportunities. I mean, we could start with complete recycling of storm water. We could have 2 piping systems, one for drinking and one for your other uses, for your toilet, your garden, etc. We could look at ways of being totally self-sufficient in terms of energy generation. The Germans are developing roof tiles now, which you probably all know about, that are a solar panel. So every house in a new city should have that on it. We had some American friends who were showing us carpet squares that when you walk on them, they generate electricity. So you can feed the kids the purple cordial and get them really hyped up and get them running around the house, and you'll be saving on your power bills. And you can do the same with footpaths, and you could probably do the same also with road if you put concrete paving in. So there's things that we know now are being developed. There are things that we know will be developed in the next decade that will be even smarter. And I think what we need to actually do is set our sights for that sort of development. Think about the brightest possible things that could be added to a new city, and not just make this somewhere good enough, but make it a role model for the world that everyone else can follow. To give you one basic stat that really stuck with me in our Developed Victoria studies was that London, with a population of about 10 million, Greater London, had a footprint that was 1/6 the size of Melbourne, with 5 million people. So we've got 1/12 the density. We know that out on the fringes of Melbourne, public transport is not good, and where it is, it takes a long time to get anywhere. All our focus, I think, for the last 50 years, or probably post-war, has been about accommodating cars and trucks, and we haven't done enough about public transport, or in so many European cities that the commuting by public transport is taken as a norm. In many European cities, getting around by bicycle, in places like Holland, we see that as a norm. So I think we need to take a view that just because we're a huge continent with a small population, we don't need to actually spread out as much, and we can make cities more livable, we can make them safer. I'd like to see a new city developed, or the new development of urban development on the fringe of Geelong that actually takes all these factors that Martin's talking about, where we can actually bring the very best and include that. I think the other thing that is particularly important, that this is something that needs a bipartisan approach, and I was really happy to do this initial development on our regional development program with Steve Bracks, because it transcends politics. It's something that we're looking at planning for our communities, not just 20 or 30 years ahead. We're talking about planning for centuries ahead. And we also need to actually realise that many of our resources, and particularly water, are a limited resource, and we need to use that efficiently and reuse it efficiently. And then those sorts of issues have not been on the agenda. We know about transport congestion, we know about the issues of livability, we know the issue of housing affordability. And that is a significant one, particularly for many young couples as they try and start their families off. If we can create these sorts of developments where they can develop and get a block of land and build a house, I think on our studies, Jeff, we've shown that you could probably do it at 2/3 the cost of what people are paying out on these fringes of Melbourne, where they're probably twice the commuting distance to the city. My daughter and her husband got married about a year ago, and they bought a property down at Parkdale. They both work in the city. It takes them about 50 minutes by train. 1.3 million for a duplex, 3-bedroom plus an office, saddled with a huge mortgage. We think in a development that Jeff's talking about around Geelong, we could do that same sort of property probably for about $800,000. $500,000 less in mortgage. That's a game changer. So it's not a matter of this is a nice thing to have. This is something that we actually have to do. And I'd like to compliment the RMIT and the enthusiasm that all the other participants in this forum are taking. And we need to make sure that the people who are developing the policy and implementing the policy realise that this is not just something that is a nice to have, which decentralisation has been for so long. Oh yes, well, we're all in favour of decentralisation, and we're all in favour of motherhood and a few other things, but doing bugger all about it. We know from the studies that we've looked at, with the movement of people coming out of the metropolitan area to our three next largest centres, to Ballarat, Bendigo and Geelong, there was an average of 188 people over the last 5 years went to Bendigo, an average of 200 per year went to Ballarat, and an average of 700 went to Geelong out of Melbourne. At the same time, Melbourne grew by 125,000 that year. So that's statistically irrelevant. And nothing that we've done in the past, or nothing that people are talking about in the future, is having any solid impact on real decentralisation. I think connectivity through a high-speed rail, I'm not talking about one that is slightly faster, 160 kilometres, I'm talking 300 to 350 kilometres now, where people could get from the outskirts of Geelong into the city in under 20 minutes. That's the game changer. And then we can build the urban development that we all want, we all need, and we all deserve. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Certainly the issues that are raised by the propositions which we're now beginning to see are very much something which we are seeing as really imperative to respond to. I think that really where we're trying to approach this agenda is through some connectivity between the ways in which we're operating. From my perspective, I think it's about how we can work between planning, how we can work between transport, how we can actually raise agendas around housing, and to really begin to understand both urban greening infrastructure as well as technological infrastructure really begin to feed together in order to truly understand that the challenges and the opportunities that we have presented. What I will do, though, at the moment is I'll introduce our next three speakers who I'll have cycle through. To begin with, Paul Menifee, Associate Professor Paul Menifee, who's out of the School of Architecture and Urban Design and also a member of the Urban Futures ECP Executive, and is indeed a principal of MVS Architects, who were responsible in part for the new academic street development that we see just adjacent to us here. And his work for many years is really beginning to look at unpacking some of the contemporary ways that we might be thinking about how we pursue urban development. We'll then be followed by Jennifer Koulis from Nightingale Housing. I'm sure many of you will be aware of the Nightingale model, which appears to be going from strength to strength. And one of the key agendas here is the manner in which Nightingale is not only now talking about buildings, but is actually talking about whole communities, where these agendas of shared amenity, where the agendas of perhaps living in smaller apartments with sharing communal facilities, are also then beginning to look at scaled operations through the Nightingale Village and the way in which the village is actually facilitating environmental principles at scale, and also agendas as to how we might be able to respond to the particularities of density. The work that we've done through the Urban Futures ECP also really begins to cement the idea of what a healthy city might be, and for us to understand how 34 dwellings per hectare is understood as an optimum density in order to promote a healthy lifestyle, which is supported by adequate public transport and of course walkable and bikeable local amenity. These things are things which our next guest, Catherine Sunnerton, who is an Associate Director at MGS Architects and also teaches at the University of Melbourne, but we would claim her as RMIT alumni. And her work every year with taking a group of students to the Netherlands through a studio there called Opportunistic Urbanism, which begins to look at how the ways in which our European friends seem to be progressing a whole range of opportunities through the manner in which they develop their new settlements. So I'll hand over to Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Pat, for your excellent introduction to the issues that are facing Melbourne and the kind of large-scale thinking that we need in order to address some of the problems that are obviously facing our cities and are becoming more and more pressing every day. I want to talk about a few things, but first of all, just to introduce the RMIT Urban Futures ECP, which Martin has talked about. It's collaborative research in transformative solutions to today's and future complex and urban challenges. And it really brings together all the different disciplines across the university which are addressing issues to do with the city in their different ways through their own lenses, with the intention of finding truly synthetic solutions that can draw upon the expertise of all those disciplines together. So that includes social scientists, engineers, economists, planners, people involved in policy, and given it's Design Week, also designers. So one of the things I'd like to talk about briefly is to talk a little bit about what role designers might play in the kind of large-scale urban questions that we'll be addressing. So here's the challenge. Based on current population projections, and there's no reason to think that they're going to change given the Prime Minister's announcement that they'll be cut but by 2,000 people. Immigration will be cut by only 2,000 people next year. I think we can reasonably and indeed prudently plan for 11 more Canberras to be, the equivalent of 11 more Canberras to be introduced into Melbourne. I thought it'd be interesting to really just compare, do a little bit of a then and now, and there are a few reasons for doing this. On the left, I think, is 1985, and on the right is the Google Maps, our best cut at the same view. And I think what we can see is just this explosion of growth, most of which is residential within the city of Melbourne. And I think one of the things which is interesting to ponder here is to the extent in which we were able to plan and predict this kind of growth. I mean, I recall in my early stages, in my early career as an architect, where we were proposing medium density or indeed high-rise housing. And as recently as the 90s, it was seen as an impossibility. And it was seen as an impossibility because no one would live in that mode of housing. And what we see has grown, of course, facilitated by immigration, by the success of our university sectors, by the City of Melbourne's Postcode 3000 initiatives, and a whole set of other conditions. We've seen this, what was an entirely alien typology, come to increasingly dominate the very centre of Melbourne. So that's one point I wanted to make. And the other point is really looking at Melbourne from afar and wondering whether the way that Melbourne is growing is in any way optimal. And Pat made the point, and I think it's important to emphasise that the growth has been largely within the central zone of Melbourne, where it's possible to construct high-rise towers. And on the periphery of the city, it's very much been business as usual. And this is business as usual, which goes back to the early part of last century, where it was individual, detached, 12 dwellings per hectare. And that's what continues, and that's what grows out from the edge of Melbourne. And of course, what we're confronting is the issue of congestion. So the difference between the white contour here and the edge of the blue area marks the distance that one can travel within the same time period at peak and non-peak hours. So this is just starting to give an indication of the limits to the model that we currently understand. And it's really suggesting that there are limits to the way that we can continue with the current model. So I think one of the questions that underlies this discussion is really whether what we're doing is broken and what we're going to do about it. And I think one of the questions for designers comes with this question of confronting the greenfield, because architects, urban designers have been focused very much on the growth which is happening in the centre of the city, and they need to because of the complexity. But much of what we're seeing is happening almost independent of a design or a strategic vision, and that's happening on the edge of the city. But nevertheless, because of the reduction in the amount of sites which are occupiable with high density development and the difficulties in redeveloping the middle zones of Melbourne, we'll need to look again at greenfield solutions. Just to finish off this piece on the role for design in addressing this large-scale urban questions, when we see people like Billy Giles Corti who are working and producing really strong empirical evidence based on the analysis of the existing city, and we have a series of strong policy propositions and also a set of technical solutions which are being promised, it seems that the role of design is in these areas. So I think synthesis is one of the critical things that designers always do. They bring together a set of competing requirements into a solution which tries to satisfy all of them in the most satisfying way possible. And I think that in a multidisciplinary team is really a core role of the designers. There's envisaging and modelling, so there's actually seeing what is being proposed in a way which can be directly apprehended. There's testing a set of formulations and propositions that might come from somewhere else, and I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. Proposing, and indeed generating a social licence for a transformed city. I wanted to look just briefly, and this is looking at the designers in the audience, and just to go back to a time where there are a set of bold urban propositions that were put forward, and this is of course Le Corbusier in the 20th century. Now these kind of propositions were so maligned in the I think originally in the battles between Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses that were carried out in the 60s and the 70s. I think that's led in many ways to a retreat of the scope of the design professions and what they can comment and propose. So there's no question that this model of the tower block that was put forward was a vision which has become fulfilled in all the horror that we now know. So the question for us is, what are the new models that we can propose that can have similar purchase and ability to transform the city? And again, Kenzo Tange and Tokyo Bay. And so there are architectural models for this. This is Kirsten Thompson's Napier Street Housing. It's an infill development in Fitzroy. It really is regarded as a successful model that increases density and draws on all the local amenity and reflects that in its form and the rethinking of the function of these developments. But I think one of the questions which is really pressing for us is how can these solutions, and I know that Jen will be talking about Nightingale in a little while, how can these kind of solutions that work well in the inner city areas be scaled up to the extent that we need to consider it? So beginning as an architect, there's this question of what is the city? And I think architects tend to think, oh, well, it's just buildings multiplied. Beginning to think about it much more deeply in terms of the opportunities for living and working that are provided by the city, and seeing the city as an organism and a support system that can really lead us to a rich, healthy life, changes this perspective away from questions of form and propriety and bring us towards something else. And so the beginning of my journey to try and understand cities was looking at this idea of connectivity and trying to think of what that actually meant. Now, this is very abstract and I'm sure somewhat confronting, but I'll try and explain it very quickly. This is a very simple model of a city, and the numbers, each of the grid squares are a site, and the numbers in each of the grids represent the travel time between that particular grid square and all the others within the city. So it's really a proxy for connectivity. And there are some interesting things that you notice. So if you look at the 40 in the middle, which is the very central place within my model city, and the diagonal corners, you can see that there's a substantial decrease in the amount of connectivity between those different locations within the city. And that means that even if something were as well connected by rail, there would still be an enormous penalty in travel time in order to be able to reach anywhere else to do any of the things that one might want to do within the city. So the periphery is always going to be substantially disadvantaged. And the other thing to note is how this gets worse as we go further and further. And I think Melbourne's getting to a point where the edge is now so far away from the centre that it's becoming increasingly difficult to enjoy the metropolitan benefits which are offered by the city itself. So this was something that we developed further in the abstract into a computer model and put against that the, I think that's going to work, the notion that building, that more valuable sites are better connected, and that building taller buildings is more expensive per square metre. And putting just those two things together with the connectivity of a graph lets us model overall urban forms and explore a whole set of things. And here we're exploring what happens when we make fast connections within the city, and you can see that these better connected and therefore denser areas follow. Now there's a whole lot of work that follows from that, but I'm not going to go into it in detail. And so this is work that we were doing with students and also in collaboration with New Rail that was exploring this thought experiment of what a city of 300,000 people connected by fast rail to 22 minutes from the CBD on a greenfield site with 35 dwellings per hectare might look like. And to explore these qualities of sustainability, desirability, prosperity and health. And so this is the same model that we saw before, but here growing a city, if you like, across a much more complex topographical and grid of transport connections. And so the purpose here is really to generate a set of diversity, a set of different densities, a set of different housing possibilities which aren't available within the Melbourne metropolitan area itself. And then we drilled down into that and started looking with the students at what the key attributes might be within that density map which has been generated. And then explore a whole set of different urban forms. So 35 dwellings per hectare, for example, is talked about as desirable, but there are so many different ways of generating that density within the city. And so these are the kind of things, questions that design can start to explore. And I think you can see implicit in this like a whole set of choices around how one might live and work within a new greenfield city. And I think one of the key questions in this work is this question: if we build, will they come? And so really to answer that, we need to start to design in some detail and envisage what these streets might be. So this is further work that we've done, really exploring what these different densities might offer in terms of new possibilities for living within the city. So here we are at 50 dwellings per hectare, and that's a net measure, is this kind of urban fabric and interactivity becomes possible. The one before was 35, and then this is at 105 dwellings per hectare with a much denser thing. And I want to just move quickly. It's always perilous presenting the work of colleagues, but I want to look at this, and this was taking a completely different design perspective. This is the work of Mark Jark, looking, start really beginning with from a landscape perspective and looking at the ground and what is present as being one of the fundamental drivers. And he's looking at issues such as how infrastructure in a very broad scale can be a prompt for different kinds of, he calls, new civic armatures, open spaces, and supercharge the development by really working with the character of the land and green opportunities within the new city. I'm going to move through it for reasons of time. And he looked at methods of extracting density and different kinds of urban form from existing fabric and combining those together around these urban armatures, the idea of the 20-minute city represented as circles, and developing a whole set of urban propositions around those ideas. Looking at issues of program and how both lifestyle and productivity can be supported. And then I'll finish with this, which is this morning's Herald Sun. So this thing got real with respect to Geelong. It's a 32-minute trip. We're thinking 20 minutes is better, but ScoMo's prepared to go 200 kilometres an hour, no faster. And this is the proposition that we're looking at. So what I'd like to explore in the panels is how this kind of scenario that we're talking about, analogous to the map and the thinking that we saw earlier, might be explored around the specific areas of Geelong and opening particularly this area along Corio, between Corio and Avalon, and bringing all those characteristics of productivity, health, sustainability to a really new form of urban fabric that might exist in these areas. Okay, thank you all.
Great, we now have Jen Coulis from Nightingale Housing.
Thanks, Martin. I might bring this down for Shorty. Hi, I'm Jen Coulis and I'm the Business Development Manager at Nightingale Housing. We exist to deliver sustainable housing that supports the wellbeing of diverse, resilient communities. And we do this through the delivery of triple bottom line housing at cost. As has been mentioned both by Paul and Pat today, we are seeing a significant period of growth in Melbourne. So the average of 100,000 new Melburnians year on year for the next 3 decades. And what this is doing is kind of forging Melbourne's housing population into kind of 2 key models. The first is that of renters living in the inner city and in the inner ring suburbs, and the other are owner-occupiers living on the city's expanding fringes. And often this is because first home buyers think this is their only kind of accessible entry point into the housing market. So what we get is a series of urban compression happening in the inner city, largely populated by a population of renters and owned by investors overwhelmingly. And to the right here at Craigieburn, some 25 kilometres outside of Melbourne, we get a sprawl. So the kind of primary issue with this is that one's car is located in their garage. We leave, we drive to work, we come home, we do that act over and over again, leaving little opportunity to run into our neighbours. So about 10 years ago, Rob Adams at the City of Melbourne took a look at some housing models around the world where kind of density was being done right in an urban context. And they looked at Rome, at Barcelona, Paris, Amsterdam, New York, and traditionally Melbourne prior to the rise of private car ownership during the mid-1950s, when it was a series of walkable villages with active ground plane with cafes and restaurants at ground and housing above, all of which was connected by various transport links. So if you look at the current delivery model for housing in Melbourne on the kind of the speculative development model, if you will, financial return far and away is favoured over livability and socially sustainable outcomes. And in 2014, Breathe Architecture kind of embarked on a prototype, if you will, of the Nightingale model. The theory behind the sustainability model for the commons was to build less and give more. And perhaps the easiest way to explain this is through the architectural features. So we removed basement car parking, there's zero car parking on site, and instead this was replaced with various car parking spaces for each dwelling and a green transport plan. A rooftop laundry was put in place as a shared amenity, and 2 square metres of space was given back to each dwelling. And what we find today is this is the hardest working social space in the building. So whilst it might seem a little bit awkward at first to wash your smalls with your neighbours, it's amazing how quickly that engenders a sense of familiarity and democratisation amongst everybody. We removed the air conditioning and replaced them instead with these light wells and ferneries, ensuring that there could be cross ventilation into each of the dwellings and saving over $300,000 in the cost plan. We removed the ceiling partitions and any plasterboard, exposing the thermal mass of the floor plates, the concrete floor plates. And this helped to regulate the internal temperature through times of heat and cooling highs and lows, regulating internal temperature and minimising the need for active cooling systems, which really, the active cooling system in here is essentially only the ceiling fan and hydronic heating. We took out the chrome and the tiles from the bathroom, removing the need for toxic glues and adhesives, and instead just exposed the CFC with a zero VOC water finish. And most importantly, perhaps, all of our buildings in their ongoing life cycle are fossil fuel in operation. So we don't reticulate gas, and we have a strategic partnership with Momentum Energy and Tasmanian Hydro, which means that we can offer green power at an aggregated purchase price cheaper or similar to the cost of black power to our other neighbours in Brunswick. So coming back to this prevailing model of development in Melbourne, what we found was that we achieved affordability in this first building in Brunswick, but only seemingly for the first 24 people that bought in. When it came to reselling, it seemed like affordability was a one-time ticket only. There was born Nightingale 1. Now, there's a kind of one key shift that happens with Nightingale 1, and that's the introduction of the Nightingale caveat. And this means that we can preserve the financial sustainability of the building into perpetuity as dwellings pass between old and new owners. So the caveat basically suggests that if you own a Nightingale apartment, you're welcome to sell it at any time and to anybody you like. We ask only that there's first rights access to the Nightingale waiting list for 30 days before it's passed into the open market, and you're able to sell that apartment for the amount you paid, plus the index increase in housing in the suburb. Now, the increase is indexed to housing as opposed to apartment dwellings, so owners still enjoy an uplift over time, but we do find that that's a significant enough deterrent for investors to partake in a Nightingale project. I'd now like to kind of turn my attentions, because Nightingale's traditionally been an urban housing model, how this might apply to the regional context we're discussing today, and through kind of some key trigger questions. The first of which is, how is Nightingale a catalyst for community? So firstly, I've kind of already mentioned that architecturally we attempt to design in social spaces and utility spaces to encourage interaction between residents. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the people. And these are all the first residents, the 24 families that brought into the Commons in its first iteration. They're ultimately the ones who self-organise and sustain a dynamic and evolving building community. And what we do is, I guess, to try to engender that, is keep each building community to only 70 people maximum. We kind of find and understand that socially we can know the names and anecdotal details of about 150 people. Beyond that, we kind of don't really hope that we'll actually remember someone's mum's name or when their birthday is if we run into them in the lift, and we don't tend to engage. So by capping the size of a building community, we hope to kind of engender that confidence in the residents. With each new building project, we start with an information session. We present what forthcoming project we have and each of the dwellings and see if people are interested in the community in taking part or in buying into an apartment. Once a building community is formed, we hold a day at the pub or a nearby restaurant where the future project will be located so that all the future residents can meet each other some 2 years before we break ground. And these are the residents of Sky House in the forthcoming Nightingale Village. So they had a pretty good day that day, one of whom is now a volunteer with us at Nightingale 1, which is pretty good. Nightingale Housing. And as the building starts to go up, we run building tours with each of the residents. This is coordinated by the wonderful Dominica Watt in our office. So residents can see their new home being built every 4 to 6 weeks and see it come to life. They get to meet the foreman and the superintendent and speak with the architects. And so another key question, I suppose, with the context of new regional cities is how Nightingale might be a mechanism for affordability. As Pat's kind of already touched on, growth can be a difficult period for housing affordability as we kind of see land scarcity commonly associated. We know that Geelong is the second fastest growing city in Australia, so this seems like a particularly pertinent conversation. Additionally, there has been a lot of suggestion in the media that I've read in the last week that the land value capture is a key mechanism of delivering rail projects, with kind of various suggestions that land values can increase 25 to 40%. So this is kind of an obvious reason why housing affordability might be compromised without intervention. So firstly, we deliver housing at cost, as I've already mentioned. So we don't have the developer margin commonly associated with speculative housing development. When we deliver housing at Nightingale, see if my pointer works, we buy the land at the same cost that a developer does. We pay our consultants and architect the same that a developer does. What we don't do is engage a marketing team, build a display suite, or hire a real estate agent to sell our projects. We simply go out to the community, explain our project, offer them to come by and visit Nightingale 1 and see what we've built before, and we find that we sell them just fine that way. We don't really save much in the construction process. We take out a basement car park, we take out air conditioning, but we put in the best glazing that money can buy, and we add in solar panels and other equipment that cost quite a lot of money. So in the wash, it all kind of comes out the same. But lastly, we don't actually charge any developer margin at all, so we have to cover the 15% return on investment for our equity providers, but beyond that we take a zero return. We offer 20% affordable housing in all future coming Nightingale projects. In Nightingale Village, we're working with community housing providers, Women's Property Initiative and Housing Choices Australia. So they're going to own and operate 20% of the dwellings as affordable housing, which is a minimum of 20% under market, and that'll be done so into perpetuity. We also think that we just do it better together. So we're constantly working to try to find genuine impact investment in Australia, which means concessional returns on finance. That's a very difficult task, but we keep at it. And we're currently working with the ATO to finalise a Bauer Group and model or a build group model, which means that residents will be able to put their own funds in as equity in a future project and save on GST. So potentially 10% off the ticket price of their future home. So how does Nightingale instigate policy change? The Moreland Integrated Transport Strategy is an undertaking by Moreland City Council, which is where the Commons and Nightingale 1 are located, which is looking at current transport patterns and hoping to make more sustainable choices for the future in the municipality. As part of this last week, Council voted on a change to car parking laws. So currently in Australia, in every municipality except the City of Melbourne and the City of Sydney, each council requires any future residential development to have a minimum number of car parks. Last week, Moreland decided that they were actually going to flip that on its head. So there's now a maximum number of car parks allowed in any development, but the minimum is 0. So it's necessary to then provide reasoning as to why residents need car parking rather than justify why they don't. And in such a well-connected municipality, we think it's a wonderful adoption. Given that the Commons and Nightingale 1 both have 0 car parking on site, we hope that we gave a proven example that supported this policy change. What's also interesting in terms of policy change or what we do is in 2014, we built the Commons, and in 2017, Nightingale 1 was built across the street on Florence Street. And what starts to happen when we get beyond the single lot scale is something more emerges. And that's this. This is Florence Street, which we worked in collaboration with a lot of the other residents in surrounding streets to sign a petition. Council ultimately supported our position and closed Florence Street. It's now got a parklet in it. When our neighbour finally builds next door, we're going to close it. They'll rip up the asphalt and actually build a pocket park. But for now, the residents self-organise and hold parties like this. And it's not just residents from the Commons or Nightingale 1, it's also people from neighbouring Breeze Street and Hope Street. So it's really lovely what we start to see when just given a framework for community, people really take it up. The kind of next iteration of this is Nightingale Village. It's going to be 7 buildings by 7 different architects, or at least that was the original plan. The previously mentioned Mark Jakes actually prepared this wonderful site plan, so I have to thank him. These are the 7 sites. And what happens is by collectivising as a precinct, what we've been able to do is create one subterranean car share hub where there'll be 20 EV or electric vehicles supplied by GoGet Car Share. And that meant that we could close the 3 streets here. There'll be a pocket park in Duckett Street at the centre and 2 kind of greened laneways to the north and south. Just before I came this morning, I participated in an event in Moreland. The site furthest north, which was actually going to be a building by WOWOWA, has actually been purchased by Moreland City Council, and they announced this morning that they'll be building a 2,000 square metre public park to the north of the precinct. So by showing what greening can be done, by really essentially the architecture community, we hope we've prompted this policy change. Nightingale has been part of what we hope will be one of the most successful precinct renewal projects in Melbourne over the last decades, and I think Moreland understand that if they don't purchase this land now, it won't actually be feasible to do so later, and they've made this strategic purchase. So Nightingale in regional Victoria. I get approached all the time about doing projects in regional Australia, around Australia, but predominantly in Victoria. I'm happy to say we're currently exploring a project in Ballarat, so we'll start community engagement in the next few months. It is incredibly difficult, and there's kind of one key factor that's really hard, and that is that the upfront cost to purchase a house and land package at the fringes of Geelong or any regional centre is price comparable to Nightingale apartment purchase. This is a little area on the edge of Geelong in 2009, and this is at today. And whilst it seems as though they're price comparable up front, we actually find that in the long term, the cost of living is substantially different, and vulnerabilities to fluctuations in the price of petrol and utilities mean that dwellers here are a lot more vulnerable than potentially people living in something like a Nightingale community. And this is mainly due to the strategic partnerships we have, not only by collectivising and living in a more dense context, but also, as I mentioned, through a strategic partnership with Momentum Energy, so we buy green power as a collective, which gives us purchase power, and also through a strategic partnership with GoGet Car Share, so we collectivise a car fleet and we share those for those who don't use a car every day. Ultimately, I hope that I've been able to communicate that whilst we are an urban housing provider, we do see that there are many ways in which we could offer something, whether that's through community, preserving affordability, and also through sustainability and ecological sustainability, should we kind of have initiatives like this included in any future visions for regional centres in Victoria. Thank you.
And our next speaker, Catherine Sunderton from MGS Architects. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the previous speakers. It's great to hear that Nightingale is planning something in Ballarat. That's definitely very exciting. So I'll be taking a bit of a different approach. I'll be talking about networked cities and livable neighbourhoods. And so this is really drawing on a bit of an exchange that I've had over the last 6 years or so between the Netherlands and Victoria. And so really thinking about what we can learn from each other. And I think I actually followed the launch of Balance Victoria last August. And there were lots of really great concepts that were discussed. This idea of a decentralised regions, very interesting. High density near public transport. Walkable neighbourhoods. I think Billy Giles Corty was talking about that. And really this focus on evidence-based policy and setting a clear centralised vision. These are words that make me very happy. And I think these are words that also remind me of a place that I'm quite familiar with. So I lived, studied and worked in the Netherlands for 3 years quite a while ago, and I do have an architectural background, and I was quite interested in the kind of questions that were discussed before about how can architects start to design at a much larger scale. Is there a role for design? And so here in the Netherlands, you've got this incredible kind of high-speed rail that connects these very livable neighbourhoods. There were some other words that were mentioned in the Balance Victoria launch that I was a little less comfortable with. This idea of private sector-led investment and also a focus on greenfield development. They kind of reminded me of some other things. So I think it's definitely, I think that's been a theme coming through today, that we need to be very strategic about how we direct this next type of investment. And so if we really are looking at this idea of comparing Geelong and Melbourne to the Netherlands, you'll find that there's a concept of something called the Randstad. So that's really the collection of cities of Amsterdam, The Hague, Rotterdam and Utrecht are thought of together as one metropolis or as a ring city. And so if you see each of them in that 100 by 100 kilometre area, it's really quite interesting to see that they're quite comparable in size physically, but the population in the Randstad is exactly twice what we have. So, and yet there's so much kind of green space between each of those cities. And this idea of kind of looking at and comparing these two different regions is something that I've been exploring for the last 3 years. I've been teaching a subject through the University of Melbourne in partnership with TU Delft University in the Netherlands and also Delta Metropolis Association. And it was really about this information exchange between these two places. So I think it's quite clear what we thought we were learning from them, but what's quite interesting is that they wanted to learn from us as well in terms of how to, if you look at some of the existing neighbourhoods in Melbourne, you get this incredible richness and diversity, which they haven't had so much, given that they've had quite top-down, in some places, monotonous development. So they really wanted to learn from that diversity. So it kind of went both ways. I think a really important part of the studio and also a general approach in the Netherlands is this idea at designing at multiple scales. So you really have architects in partnership with planners and economists, etc., thinking about the whole nation as one element, right down to precincts and individual dwellings. And so that's really what I'll be talking about today, is those two scales of the whole networked region and the precincts themselves. And through this studio, we've been able to visit a lot of these incredible places, but also speak to experts in terms of how this works. So today I'm going to be speaking to you about 4 things. Firstly, this idea of the Randstad as a networked metropolis. Then I'll be looking at 2 new Dutch neighbourhoods and what lessons that we can glean from them. Then I'll be looking at 2 projects that I've been working on at MGS Architects. And finally, looking at what opportunities each of these examples give for the future of a balanced Victoria. So if we go back to this idea of the Randstad, this drawing on the right actually shows the commuting networks between those different cities of Rotterdam, Amsterdam, The Hague and Utrecht. And what you'll see is in green, that's when you have quite an equal exchange between those different cities, whereas in red you see people from the regions coming into those major places. So this is a very, very unusual situation. There's not many, there are, but there's not, it's very different to what we have in Melbourne. And I think what's important to know is there's also a high-speed rail between Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and you can get there in 40 minutes. But alongside that one high-speed rail route, you have a whole diversity of a very rich regular rail network that really gives you that true network. And what you can find is that a whole lot of people actually do live in Amsterdam and work in Rotterdam and then go to The Hague for a meeting. It really starts to function as one city. And you can really have, each of the cities has their own role in the network as well. It's not that they're all doing the same thing. You can, The Hague's obviously the heart of the European governance. Amsterdam is this incredible historic city, and Rotterdam's seen as a more up-and-coming city since the bombings in the Second World War as a place of design. But this idea of this networked metropolis hasn't happened by chance. Obviously, they've got that long history of how the cities have developed over millennia or over centuries in terms of the medieval cities, equal distance by how far you could get by horse. And then in the 20th century came this idea of thinking about that the ring of cities. And this was a very conscious planning decision. I thought it was interesting that Paul mentioned that the green fields on the edge of the city are kind of unplanned. I think they're very planned. It's just that that's what our planning system is enabling at the moment. And so, yeah, they've really had this concerted effort to do this. But then they had a period of what I've heard them call collective amnesia. So this was a period between 1995 and 2005 where there was a big demand for housing and everyone thought, oh, it's much too difficult to build it in the city. Let's build it on the edge of the city. And it's, by Australian standard, it seems like a good level of density and quite livable, but you're still building a dormitory on the edge of the city that's quite hard to get to by public transport. And to correct that, there's now a new obsession with this idea of agglomeration power. So we know that since we're going towards more knowledge-based jobs, that people need to be able to get to those jobs really easily. And so there's a focus on what's the maximum number of people who can reach each other quickly in a kind of high-quality environment. And so there's this program called the Atlas of Smart Urbanisation, and here they looked at the existing cities of The Hague, Delft and Rotterdam and mapped out each of the sites that have a potential for development for more greater density in those areas. And they actually put it into a book. So there's this incredible series of books where they've got the site, the possible density, and they're actually using this as a tool to kind of talk to developers, talk to landowners, talk to future residents about what might happen in these areas. And a really crucial part of it is this concept of having the right density and the right type of program in the right place. So each of those sites has been put into a series of categories. So you've got international, national, regional, public transport and car. And so that really determines, they've set different density targets for each of these. So it really says that you want to have the most density in the most highly accessible locations that have the greatest metropolitan drawing power. Right, and then in the less dense places, you can really, give space for farm, for production, that kind of thing. So with that broader context, I now want to introduce two projects that are actually new neighbourhoods in the Netherlands. One's more focused on housing with a bit of work, and the other one is more about work with a bit of living. So the first one is Balkslotterham in the north of Amsterdam. So this is a former, you've got the central station down there in the bottom. So just across the River Eye, you have this large area that used to be very, it was kind of where they had all the ports and the shipping, very contaminated, had a lot of social housing in there in the 60s, and it was largely owned by the city of Amsterdam. And so they drew up this beautiful plan of how they were going to work with big developers to roll out a whole lot of housing. But then, of course, 2008 happened, so there was no kind of interest for developers or ability to do that development. And so what the city decided to do is actually carve up this site into a series of smaller parcels and sell them to individual families and individual groups. And so what you have here are the people camping out for their opportunity to buy one of these affordable sites. And then there was a long series of participation and workshops for each of these groups to work together to build the communities. And one thing that was interesting was that rather than building just a kind of rolling out the same type of development, they really wanted to try and get the richness and diversity that we see in existing neighbourhoods around the world. And so they're actually looking to Melbourne as well as one of those, Carlton in Melbourne is one of those examples. And so what you see through all of these processes is they've built this incredible, rich kind of neighbourhood. I took this photo 6 months after it was finished. I once had someone say to me, "Oh, don't worry about Docklands, just give it 20 or 30 years and it will be great." I think that that's a little bit too long to wait, considering that we can have these options. And this is the benefits that you get from involving future residents in the design. And it's not only about those very low-rise elements, they also have a mixture of offices and apartment buildings at a greater density. And you can see here that they've quite artificially orchestrated this rich diversity of an existing city. And another important element of this project is that there is something called circular Balxlederham. So that's a project for the entire neighbourhood to make it start to have some of those sustainable initiatives that we were talking about earlier in terms of reusing water and waste and really reducing the amount of energy used in that area. So that's the kind of things that you can achieve when you're looking at a whole neighbourhood. You can start to really invest in those precinct-wide initiatives. The second project in the Netherlands is one called Skiovers in Delft. So here you can see it's really on the edge of the city, a former industrial area. And I don't have the annotations, but I don't know if I can do this. Yeah, so essentially you've got the old city of Delft here. You've got the TU Delft University here, some 60s housing, and then finally this is the former kind of industrial area that used to benefit from being on the river Ski. And so now there's a lot of those industrial uses are moving out, but not all at once, and it's all owned by different landholders. So they wanted to come up with a plan of how this area could slowly evolve and keep some of the qualities that are already there and keep some of the workplaces. So here they've decided to have a bit of a strategy of creating a lively mixed-use area by adding some housing, but then also making sure that they keep space for keep space for workplaces and keep affordable workplaces in this area. And some of that is through retaining some of those old buildings. And so this is a broader version of the whole project. And you can see again, trying to kind of have that mix, that diversity of density and diversity of uses, and a plan that can happen almost organically over time as different sites become available for redevelopment. And so again, you start to see that idea of giving space for parks, but allowing a certain level of density. And so in those two projects, there's quite a few themes coming through. There's that idea of having the right program and the right density in the right place. The benefits of having precinct-wide sustainability. The importance of really combining living and working rather than just having one or the other. Looking at having different actors involved rather than having one big development company that just does the whole thing. And finally, retaining the built fabric, not only for the authenticity of the neighbourhood, but also for affordability. So now I'll change track to two projects that I've been working on in Melbourne. So both are for existing precincts and how we can see how they can transform. The first is Monash Clayton University. So MGS Architects worked on the master plan back in 2011. And we've really seen the campus itself transform. So it's gone from being quite a car-dominated area to a quite incredible campus with high-quality buildings, high-quality spaces, a really clear kind of pedestrian network through the site. But this is, it was when we were doing all of this work with the university, we realised that it was actually one of the biggest employers in Melbourne. And that if you combine it with the hospitals that are nearby, you can really start to see it as being a real hub for employment and a way of decentralising the city. And so this actually came into Plan Melbourne, our city's strategic plan about 5 years ago, this concept of the National Employment and Innovation Clusters. So now Monash is one of those, but you've also got them in Sunshine, Latrobe and East Werribee. And sadly, they have put the legend on top of Geelong, but Geelong is there as well. And so a really exciting new potential for this is, of course, the idea of the suburban rail loop. So this was launched last year, the idea of it, and that we would be able to connect up each of those national employment clusters with the airport. And so, when we're talking about decentralisation, I think that idea of decentralisation of Melbourne within Melbourne is an important part of that idea. And so then we kind of started to think about the campus itself, which is the blue area in the centre, and think about what other uses, how can it kind of really open up and engage with what's happening around it to become a real city in its own right. And so we've been working with the university on sites close to the university that create an enterprise ecosystem. So this is something, again, I picked up in the Netherlands. They like to talk about different sizes of businesses as different types of animals. So you can have the bees, the mice, the gazelles and the elephants. But I think the important message here is that you've got enterprises of different scales, such as the startups versus the Microsofts or whatever else, actually feed off each other, and they form this ecosystem that's important for innovation. The final project that I'll talk to you about today is the Ballarat Creative City Precinct. So this is one we've been working on with the City of Ballarat and also with SGS Economics. So I'm hoping a lot of you know Ballarat reasonably well. It's quite an interesting city. It's only an hour and a half from Melbourne. Obviously had its boom in the gold rush. So you get this very beautiful intact street down Lydiard Street of these 19th century buildings that are quite stunning. But then in between, you have a very car-dominated space. There's lots of parking, lots of bitumen, and not that same pride in the public realm as there is in the buildings. And what we also find is that there's a lot of high vacancies in central Ballarat. No one's living there. A lot of the shops are empty. And so we worked with people from the council and the local community with a series of workshops to think about how we could reframe Ballarat and how it could really become a creative city. And so this concept of having a STEAM-activated community came about. So that's STEM plus art. So it's really thinking about how that can drive the future of the economy. And so we came up with a bit of a plan for central Ballarat. You've got the station here at the top, Lydiard Street. This is Federation University in the south, and that beautiful Sturt Street with the kind of boulevard down there. And so one of the key elements was this idea that it wasn't just about the City of Ballarat doing this project. We needed to have the whole community involved. So whether you're in the creative industries, whether you're a local resident, how can you be involved in making this happen? The second element is about creating a place to live, create, study and visit. So Federation University does have a few sites in both here and here. So how can the university really open up and engage much more with the central city and bring a lot more students to the city, because we all know that that brings a lot of vibrancy. The third point is having a place that showcases and celebrates Ballarat's unique stories and their institutions. So there's all these incredible things going on, but you can't see it. And then a place that permits playfulness, flexibility and experimentation. So given that it's a creative city strategy, a lot of people were saying, I just want a place to perform. I want to be able to do a mural or whatever else, so enabling that kind of thing. And finally, having a place of people-friendly streets that work in all seasons. So as I was saying, the public realm needs some help. But how can we, and we all know that Ballarat's cold, but how can we make it a place where you can actually be outside and embrace the seasons? I think a really key point to end on with this project was that, when we look at the renewal of kind of existing regional cities, and I'm thinking about Geelong, and they've put a whole lot of investment in the public realm, which is really important, but it's only one of a whole range of strategies that you need to make a successful and thriving regional city. So we've upgraded the public realm. You need to reactivate the institutions. So how can the City of Ballarat be talking more with the universities and the art gallery and working together on collective projects? We need to have enabling policies. So Postcode 3000 was mentioned earlier today as a way of really invigorating the heart of Melbourne. So can we have similar policies in Ballarat in terms of encouraging people to live above the shops in the central city? And finally, we need enabling events and programs. So we all know that it's all good to have the buildings and the public spaces, but it's nothing without the people that are connecting around different ideas. And so with that kind of whirlwind of different projects that I've shown you, I've got 4 key takeaway messages about what could be opportunities for a balanced Victoria. So we all agree that this whole high-speed rail is crucial, but having a high-speed rail between Melbourne and Geelong is not enough. It needs to be part of a networked region, We need to kind of make those other connections in terms of looking at the other centres within Melbourne and thinking about how this can really function as a networked environment rather than Geelong being the end of the line. We need to think about having the right program and the right density in the right place. So we're doing lots of things in the right direction. The one on the image on the left is actually the new Gov Hub that's being built in Ballarat. So that's going to have 1,000 state government employees next to the train station. So that's an example of having the right kind of density and program in the right place. And then on the other hand, we've got a project called the Paddock in Castlemaine. So that's really on the edge of Castlemaine. If you think about, this is probably about the same density as having a whole lot of suburban houses, but they've gone slightly tighter together, and that gives you space to have a productive garden. It's about creating workplaces, not just housing. We don't want to just have a whole lot of commuters in Geelong that are stuck out there. We need to kind of make it a place that is a place to work as well as a place to live. And so on the left we have Runway Geelong, which is a co-working organisation, and also the Federal Woolen Mills, which is already becoming a bit of a hub for creative industries. So how can we really keep those existing warehouses rather than turning them for these types of uses rather than turning them into residential? And the final comment is that we're not going to get anywhere unless we have citizen participation and citizen-led development. So I heard before that Save Our Suburbs were saying that we couldn't do things in Melbourne, but how about we turn that on its head and say, how can we involve the community more in the decisions about the future of their neighbourhood? And that will enable, better neighbourhoods. And how can we actually take it a step further, like Nightingale, where we get the residents involved in funding new developments, and you get this incredible richness and diversity that you don't see in a lot of new neighbourhoods. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite our speakers back up to the stage and have them joined by Tim O'Lone and Amy Child from ACOM. They both operate in the cities unit of ACOM and really looking at, I suppose, a far more comprehensive way in which we might start to consider an urban proposition, both as it responds to policy, but also increasingly how it's able to engage directly with people.
I'd perhaps like to start just by introducing Amy and Tim and inviting them to respond to what they've seen so far as a way of kicking off the conversation. So Amy Child is an urban strategist and advisor with a particular interest in creating healthy, livable communities and future mobility, and she works for the engineering company ACOM. And Tim Lone is the Director of Cities in Australia and New Zealand, also from ACOM. So Tim and Amy, perhaps you'd like to just give a brief response on what we've seen so far, and perhaps we need to pull the conversation a little onto Geelong in the face of the themes that have been opened up in the discussion and the announcement that we've seen from the Prime Minister this morning. So Tim, would you like to just say a few things?
Thank you very much. I'll just clarify, we like to call ourselves a consulting firm or a design firm. We're trying to move away from just engineering, but that's... even though we have lots of wonderful engineers and we couldn't do what we do without them, although they do need other disciplines. Just in response, thank you very much. It's always great to be part of these types of sessions and just understand a bit more about what really talented people are doing, because to be honest, while let's call ScoMo's play for what it is, similar to what Suburban Rail Loop basically is, it's a way to, I guess, galvanise a particular community understanding of what the solution might be to a problem at this time. That gets a lot of airplay, it looks great on the newspapers, it makes great clickbait. I think, though, the invested intellect and actual application of that you've demonstrated is the most important thing right now. We used to call Nightingale disruptive. It's not disruptive, it's now starting to become part of the norm, it's starting to become expected. I think incisive analysis from the Ramstad, which I was actually going to talk about, but you've already done it, is in a very particular way that's relevant, not just, isn't this another nice photo of Malmo or Salzburg or something, but here are the metrics behind it, and here's the reason, and how this is a solution to a challenge that we already have, not a solution to a challenge that I'm looking to solve, if that makes sense. But from our point of view, what Amy and I do, and the cities thing that we have, is essentially across 9 particular priority cities across the world, we noticed that we had so many different disciplines that weren't necessarily, they were talking to different parts of their city, of their, citizenship, of other people working. But there weren't necessarily this focus on unlocking a particular part of a city at any particular time. So really, all this city's unit or project is, internally with ACOM, is an ability that's funded internally for us to grab a couple of like-minded people together internally and externally and really just focus for a couple of years. Self-directed research skills at which I learnt from RMIT, to try and crack and then publicise, if you like, some of these bigger issues and do it with a great deal of specificity. Sometimes we need to grab a headline just to, get a message out there. Other times we just need to go to ground and really try to investigate what's really, what the real challenges that are going to unpick these problems are. So that's what I'll say before I hand over to Amy.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tim. Yes, thanks to the previous speakers. It's really enlightening to hear some of the things. I love the Nightingale model. I think we definitely need to start thinking outside of the box in terms of traditional housing. I guess my key takeaways on this, I'm really interested in transport, being a transport planner by trade. And one thing we always talk about is land use and transport and integrating the two things. It's something we don't seem to do very well in Australia, unfortunately. And yes, whilst it's great to be talking about a high-speed link between Geelong and Melbourne, it's making sure that we actually have those policies in place to ensure that we start to reap the benefits of what that could mean in terms of housing density, etc. It's fine to put the infrastructure in, but if we don't have the supporting policies to develop the types of communities we want, we're just going to end up with more of what we're building, unfortunately, in our western suburbs at the moment and in our growth areas. Density and transport are so key. Without the density, you can't deliver the type of transport that people want. You can't develop walkable neighbourhoods. We're building communities at the moment where somebody can barely walk to buy a pint of milk. You have to get in your car. And if we don't have this policy in place to really drive that density, and we're not talking high-rise, there's some of the scary stuff that's being built out there. We're talking medium density, which Catherine gave some really good examples of. If we don't have those policies in place when we're putting in this infrastructure, we're just going to end up having the same mess that we're building at the moment, but just somewhere else. And I suppose that's one of my takeaway thoughts is, whilst we can talk about Geelong, and the regions which are going to be key as we increase our population within Melbourne, how do we make sure that we don't forget about the people that we're building for now? And there's one thing I'd recommend you doing some Googling on is the vampire effect. I think Catherine alluded to this in terms of the false economy of building low density far from the city. And I can see the allure, if you're maybe a single parent on a minimum wage salary, you don't want a $1 million mortgage. Not many people can afford that. There's this allure to these large houses that are cheap. However, you're beholden to increases in oil prices, etc. And we've seen it in America where people are buying these houses further out and suddenly the price of petrol goes up or the cost of travel. We have very heavily subsidised public transport in Australia, which is great. But what happens if we have to start paying the true cost of living out on these urban fringes where we've been attracted to buy there, but then suddenly you just can't afford to live in those areas. So it's just something to think about, again, with the densities and how we develop our transport networks. And particularly if we develop around Geelong, how do we ensure that then that has the support of that more finer grain transport to ensure that people can move around easily?
So what might be some of the things we need to look at in terms of those secondary transport networks that are facilitated by the node-to-node connections that we've focused on so far in terms of connecting Melbourne to Geelong? Tim, I think you have an interest in ferries, for example, and noting that there's a lot of brownfield and some greenfield land that is looking like it could be considered between Corio and Avalon. what are the kind of secondary transport structures that we might put in place to facilitate the kind of medium density community-based models that we've seen from Jen and Catherine?
Excellent question. A lot of work that we get involved in and I find really compelling. I had been an architect, urban designer, and dealt a lot with form and dealt a lot with that type of metric, that type of, dealt at a particular scale, but then started, again, at ACOM, working with economists, looking at business cases, how you get not private finance, but how you actually get state government and federal governments to spend money on something. And there's a particular way in which you start to demonstrate the demand for that. We're locked into, at the moment, a demand analysis type within Departments of Treasury and Finance that look at a pretty short-term or limited way of doing that. We don't yet open the valve to start to look at more of the social or environmental aspects. And once we start doing that, then we can start looking genuinely at an economic investment in that secondary type of thing. So again, ScoMo's heavy rail, bang, that's great. 37 minutes, it doesn't really matter. It's an end-to-end proposition. It does nothing for, it just basically dumps people at 2 points in Victoria. It doesn't do anything for that corridor. I'm not saying, slow it down or have more points, but if you then had a distribution system of people, of bodies, a transit system that was able to be expressed not just in the demand terms, and Patrick was talking about the building of CityLink, they didn't necessarily have a look at the types of demand analysis that we're able to now for things like Western Distributor. Those economic models only really work on really big things. City of Port Phillip, for example, have done a fantastic integrated transit strategy that deals with things that don't necessarily need to be completely economically chased to ground. They're more around a mix of analysis of social and environmental impacts. So to couch that question, it needs to be whatever that community, and including the employment community, not just the residential community, are going to find useful in an enduring way for that transition period. So again, thinking of that corridor, if we're looking at a Greenfields proposition or even from Tottenham, Werribee area, you already have people living there. You've already got a community. If you're then trying to drive that community to 35, even up to 50 dwellings per hectare, how then, again, the proposition, what are they not going to be able to have that they have now for their local transit? And how can you then provide that gap? And then how can you, and this is the next bit, and it's distinctly different, again, in Europe, they're very good at understanding this. How can you connect them from the local trips, but then transfer them to the mass transit system as well? We don't tend to make that distinction in this country enough.
So, Catherine, are there things from the Dutch example that we can learn for these kind of new builds that enable the form of medium density housing that you've been talking to?
I was just back on the mobility side of things. I think it's really interesting in the Netherlands that it is a completely integrated network. And one of the things that I personally loved about it was that there was always a train to anywhere you would want to go. But then once you got to the train station, there was this great system of bikes that you could rent for €3 a day. And so I just had my card that I could use. And it was just this completely freeing thing to know I could get anywhere in that entire country with my swipe card and a bike. It's kind of quite incredible. It's this incredible network that they have. But in terms of lessons about, how do we get the right density in the right place, I think it's much more about all the levers. I think someone mentioned earlier today, how can we even begin to consider more dense environments if we keep on building such low density at the edge? The idea of the urban growth boundary has become a bit of a joke. It's been extended so many times, and now there's so much space in there that we have put these policies in place that enable that to keep going. We have the most efficient and cost-effective development industry in the world for delivering those houses, and so that's why it's really hard to compete with them. So if we can kind of curb that a little bit, we might have a chance at other things.
And certainly that's what we're seeing in the growth of Geelong as well. Currently it is that model again repeating itself. But the opportunity of the corridor, the existing rail corridor, seems to be something that would enable us to rethink the kind of development that can occur because of the fast rail. we were talking outside potentially of keeping the slow rail as well next to it in order to provide that local slow transit that you need.
I think one thing that I've only noticed having been to Geelong on train recently is that there's no longer that connection between Geelong and Werribee because we've now bypassed it. And I think that these, it's again that idea of, it's just, monocentric city, we just need to have a radial connection from there. But what about that connection between Werribee and Geelong? Surely that's important too.
So looking at Nightingale and the way that has managed to deliver a whole new model and paradigm for the inner suburbs, what are going to be the key things in being able to scale up some of the key values and premises that are underlying Nightingale, do you think?
In terms of on a multiple lot scale?
Yeah.
I think, in the precinct, as I mentioned, in Nightingale Village, so there's this capacity to collectivise amenity beyond the lot scale. So there's a subterranean car share hub, which means we can close those streets. The existing upfield bike path has been widened where the 3 sites that border the upfield bike path border. So pushing that back in the built form means we can widen existing public amenity. I suppose the other thing that I would like to mention is, looking at how housing typology might shift if we were to move into regional Victoria. So Catherine quite rightfully mentioned that, an appropriate scale to a context. So it's difficult often in the public perception of Nightingale. There's this belief that we'd just drop another 6 or 7 story building in the middle of, a suburban context or a regional centre, which is not the case. I think we've looked a fair bit at micro townhouses and other delivery models. So
semi-detached.
Absolutely. It should be appropriate to context. So, and in that sense, looking at what we're doing and looking at in Ballarat, going out to the community and actually asking what kind of housing people want, because it hasn't been done before. We don't know whether people will be interested in the tile house typology, so our version essentially of a studio apartment, 30 square metres, or whether a family-sized home, a 3-bedroom apartment's of interest. So we are kind of throwing that open to community consultation and surveying.
So this question of will they... Sorry, is there a question from the audience? We'll take a couple of questions perhaps in a moment. So this question of will they come, I think it's a really interesting question. Going back to the recent apartment boom we'd seen in Melbourne, the answer prior to it happening would have been no, they wouldn't have come. So I'm interested in this sort of relationship between chicken and egg, and what are the things that need to be put in, both in terms of policy and infrastructure that we're talking about, but what are the visions that we need to be projecting as designers that can be looking forward to really prompting the kind of change that the numbers and the analysis are showing us needs to happen.
I might just start with a small example, but in that Buxlederham area that I showed in the north of Amsterdam, it used to really be a place that no one wanted to go to. It didn't have a good quality at all, despite being very close to the central station. And so in that case, the city of Amsterdam actually had a very contaminated site that they had this competition that any group could come with an idea of what to do with that site, and they could have it lease free for 10 years. And so this group came up with this incredible idea of remediating the soil with these kind of weeds, essentially. And then they also found out that houseboats were really affordable. And so they got these old houseboats that no one wanted them and turned them into artist studios and creative studios and actually put them on the land. And they joined them up with this kind of winding boardwalk between them. And there's also this incredible cafe and kind of event space there. And so it became this kind of hub, this hive of activity, and a lot of people started to think about the north differently. And so that was almost one of the first ones. And then you can think about things like Nightingale, like other types of citizen-led development where people are given the chance to experiment and to start something new, can actually build a different idea about what a neighbourhood is. So that can be step one, perhaps.
I was just going to say, designers have an incredible power in construing a really compelling narrative whereas a lot of other professions can't do that. And I think that's our power and it's our responsibility.
I think, sorry, just on that, I think that designers don't act in isolation though. I think our biggest strength is connecting other disciplines, and that we're no longer that 60s architect that draws the plan from above.
The Robert Moses model, indeed. We're on time, but I'm told we do have the capacity to take 2 questions from the audience. Sir, I think you were eager before.
David Hardy, Rail Futures Committee member and also Geelong resident. Observation as a Geelong resident, Geelong's going through all the sort of issues that Melbourne has, but in lesser terms, in terms of uncontrolled development south of Geelong, served by a single rail line. Geelong generally served by inadequate, low frequency, poor hours of service public transport in an inadequate bus system. We have currently a situation where government, state government particularly, and federal government with NDIS relocated a lot of government departments to Geelong and Ballarat and Bendigo to a certain degree. Beyond that, the obvious question is, all of this about fast trains is fine, but how do we get the jobs into Geelong? It's no good Geelong just becoming a commuter suburb for Melbourne.
Could I just quickly respond? Western Sydney has the exact same issue, and it's quite amazing how the parallels between the west of Melbourne and what is now called Western Sydney, from Parramatta out to the imaginary airport, have a significant issue. They've got 3 million people as a target in the next 2 decades. There's no jobs there for them. There's 2 industries identified, and that's about it. So I think if we learn more from our brothers and sisters to the north of us, how they're starting to unpick that very issue is actually quite surprisingly good. And I think we need to bring some of that back to Geelong, Ballarat and Bendigo.
So what are they doing?
They're a little similar to what Catherine was showing before, identifying really, really big global tenants to come in and locate in particular areas, trying to avoid what you might now call the Amazon issue of over subsidising those big tenants, then identifying very, very fast, quick transitional businesses as well. A lot of those are within health and education, particularly in Parramatta, Bankstown, Penrith. Then they're also starting to look at what you might call evolved startups or SMEs, small medium enterprises, inducing them not out of mainstream Sydney, but out of Parramatta or what they now call the River City, to actually then start to literally start up as these properties start to become available. There's a lot of understanding by the government that they're not going to spend a lot of money. They don't have a lot of money to induce or move government departments out to the west. They're starting to do a lot of work around framing up the investment propositions, or at least the value proposition of businesses relocating out there. We do a bit of that. I think, though, in Western Sydney, they've got the advantage of having a very sharp target to hit. We sort of have a smudge between Geelong and Melbourne. It's not particularly well defined. I think, though, we've been doing it for a lot longer than they have. They have a crisis on their hands. We just have an ongoing series of chronic questions.
Can I just
one final question just here. We will have the ability for you to have conversations after the session. We do have to hand the room back quite soon.
Thank you very much. Very much enjoying the panel and the discussion and the presentations before. I suppose one question that I've certainly been fascinated by is the development, if you will, of obviously technologies around autonomous vehicles and so forth. And I think that's probably an area that, at least I've seen, certainly in Infrastructure Victoria paying quite a bit of attention to the 2 reports that they put out last year around autonomous vehicles. And of course, I mean, you could pit it against other large major infrastructure spending projects like Suburban Rail Loop and so forth, and the benefits. Part of the challenge, from what I understand, is that we just haven't invested in Australia in the infrastructure around mobile infrastructure for that transition, let alone energy infrastructure for charging for electric vehicles and so forth. What do you respectively see as some real critical points right now that we need to be focusing on the government side, private sector side, in order to move the conversation forward around transition to autonomous vehicles?
Sorry, my first comment would be we need to be sure that that's something we want to encourage. I don't know if it's, I think people always see it and think, oh, that's the answer, but definitely we were doing work with Monash University on what their campus is looking like in 20 years' time. And congestion's going to be such a huge issue, and that's only small, like there's only small savings you can make with autonomous vehicles in that regard. It's still people moving around in vehicles that take up a lot of space. And when you have the volumes of people going to something like Monash University, you need to have rail as a solution. Like, I think it still has an important role to play.
I think there's a really key question about autonomous vehicles which hasn't been resolved, and it really comes down to whether they'll be seen as a public service and a public resource, or whether they'll continue to be, like most cars are, a privatised resource. And I think which way that goes is going to have an enormous consequence for the city. Because if they're a private resource, we'll see what we see in KL, for example, where there's the driver sitting in the SUV, basically parking on the highways, driving around, waiting to pick someone up. And that's just going to lead to an explosion of congestion. Whereas if it goes the other way, and we're seeing it like a taxi, which is full with passengers 90% of the time, that will potentially lead to a reduction. But I think that question is not resolved as to which way we're going to go. And I think it's really a key thing for us to be thinking about. In terms of when we hit the technological tipping point, well, that will come. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be up to Australia to know when the market forces switch one way or the other. But I think in terms of the decisions that we make around the policy concerning it are critical for us to be thinking about very soon. And with that, we need to surrender the room, and I'd just like to thank Amy, Tim, Catherine and Jen for the panel, and hand back to Martin.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for coming along today, and particularly some of you who have travelled from Geelong, obviously, to hear what we've had to say. Off the back of this event, we've been invited into a discussion with Deakin University. We are also requesting meetings with Geelong and with Geelong City Council, and also with the Committee for Geelong, to really begin to now extend this conversation and really offer what we can in terms of our expertise to really begin to interrogate the opportunities and really look at the challenges that we face in order to make a realistic transition and really embrace the opportunity that the faster rail will enable. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.